I guess I get to be Mr. Brady this morning. Shouldn't be bad. I haven't preached in 2 months. So, I ought to be done by noon. No, just kidding. One of the exciting aspects of American history, I love American history. I love Baptist history. I just love history. But one of the exciting aspects of American history that I've always loved is the pioneer spirit that Americans always had. When we look around and we see everything today in our modern culture, it's kind of hard to imagine the way it was. But especially in the early 1800s, where we currently live would have been the wild, wild west in the early part of that. And during this time, we would see the country literally spread from sea to shining sea. While this expansion was going on, what many of us don't know is there were a number of unknown or little-known Baptist men and women who surrendered to follow this westward migration and endure the hardships and try to be a witness and a testimony for God at that time. Today, the story we're going to talk about, the man we're going to talk about, was one of those men. However, to give you a good feel for him, I want to discuss a little bit of what was going on in the nation at that time. Another exciting aspect of history to me, and one of the things I learned as a young child, was that it's not history, it's his story. And when you study history, and I'm weird, okay? I like names and dates. Everybody always says, oh, history is just names and dates. I'm like, yeah, so what's the problem? I enjoy that. But I realize most people don't, and some of you all are probably looking at me like I'm weird because I do. But beyond names and dates, what it is God moving in his sovereignty and his providence and God working. And as things began to progress in the United States, God was already prepared and was already beginning to set up a work so that there were people to go and meet the needs that would then come. Couple of events that began to happen to prepare for the man we're going to speak of was, first of all, there were a series of events that began to open the West to colonization. The first of those being in 1803 when Thomas Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase and more than doubling the size of America by land mass, but of course very few people were out there. However, upon immediately purchasing that, there weren't very many people besides trappers and other adventurers willing to go because of the danger of Indian attacks and also a number of other foreign governments, the British, the French, still occupying a lot of those areas. A couple other events then that began to happen. One, in 1811, General William Henry Harrison, who would later be one of our presidents, had a major defeat of the Indians at a battle called Tippecanoe, and there kind of the Indians, the oppression there kind of backed off and opened that up a little bit. Then another thing was around the War of 1812 was happening around that time. It happened about 1812. And anyway, it was beginning to happen around that time and kind of ended, really had pretty much ended with a last major battle as the British were coming up the Mississippi River, and there was the Battle of New Orleans with General Jackson, who would have, again, eventually be a president as well. Those set of events then began to open up, and settlers felt free. Let's move west. Let's go for a better life. Let's head that direction. So this is what's going on in America. At exactly pretty much the same time, our first slide comes up, the second thing that began to happen was God began to stir up Baptists to do some spiritual pioneer work. One of the first of these was Adoniram Judson, who in 1812, he and his wife and a man named Luther Rice would head over to India, eventually heading to Burma to there be missionaries. As he got to India, he began to talk to a man by the name of William Carey. Adoniram Judson was a Congregationalist, and as he began to talk to William Carey and they began to study the Bible, they became Baptists, which was great, except that he was over there being supported by Congregationalists. So he had to, they began to talk about it and said, okay, we're going to stay here, but how are we going to get support? And Luther Rice said, I'm going to go back to the United States and begin to try to stir up the Baptists about missions work. Adoniram Judson would be called the father of modern American missions, but Luther Rice was very instrumental in coming back and stirring up the burden for missions. As he began to do that, there were a couple things that happened. One, they formed what became called the General Convention of the Baptist Denomination in the United States for Foreign Missions, because back then they liked short names. And eventually that would be shortened to what they call the Triennial Convention. And at this time, in 1814, there was a man by the name of John Mason Peck. And John Mason Peck met Luther Rice, became very burdened about missions, but not foreign missions, home missions. And he said, if we're going to go and reach the lost, we need to reach the lost in our own borders. We need to follow this westward migration. So he began to be commissioned to go to the wild, wild west of Illinois and Missouri, which was the Wild West at that time. And that doesn't seem like anything to us, but it was from Connecticut where he was. It was about a 1,200-mile trip to get to St. Louis. And so John Mason Peck headed that way, and he began to start a number of churches in central Illinois and Missouri. Within just 18 years, there were some Baptists who were very Calvinist, largely in Kentucky. They began to spread into Missouri and Illinois, and I thought it was amazing. Just within 18 years, a mission board that was started for the purpose of missions began to be overtaken by Calvinists, and they no longer supported missions. Why do you join a mission board if you don't want to do missions? But anyway, that is what happened. And John Mason Peck found himself without anybody supporting him going and starting churches. So he formed what became known as the American Baptist Home Mission Society. He did that in 1832. This begins to bring us to the man we're going to talk about and the First Baptist Church of Chicago. Forming this Home Mission Society, John Mason Peck and a man named Jonathan Going established it. At exactly this same time in 1832, there was a doctor, medical doctor, by the name of John Temple. And John Temple had moved to Chicago, seeing a needy area. At that time, being a doctor wasn't as much about obtaining money for some of them as it was just simply being there to minister and help people. And this is the way Dr. John Temple felt about it. He also was a Baptist. And he was in Chicago, and he said, there is a huge need here for a Baptist church. He sent then to this newly formed American Baptist Home Mission Society and to Jonathan Going and said, can you send someone here? Now, the reason I said this is his story and God working, while all of this was going on to prepare for there to be a Baptist church in Chicago, some years before that, in 1806, another preacher by the name of Rufus Freeman started a church in Truxton, New York. Now, there's nothing significant that we know a whole lot about Rufus Freeman, except that there in his home, he raised 6 preachers. One of them, a man by the name of Allen B. Freeman, who in 1832 was looking at going to the Wild, Wild West of Ohio and starting a church there. And as he was looking at that, they contacted him and said, can somebody go to Chicago? We need someone to go. He looked at it and at first was very reluctant, but eventually accepted the direction. And soon after, he said that he was convinced that this place was the most judicious appointment. In describing Chicago at that time, we're thinking of a big city. This was his description. Chicago at the time was a wet prairie as far as eye could reach. There were a few scattered dwellings, a small military post at the mouth of the river, a trading post, 3 framed stories, and a 4th had been started. So coming to Chicago was not the great, big, beautiful city, if you like cities, that you see today. It was just an outpost, really, that was there. And God was calling Allen Freeman to that. So there, as he arrived in August of 1833, they immediately began construction of a small church building. And the church building that you see, this was about the third building that would eventually happen, and this one would have been burnt by the Chicago fire of 1871. But they immediately began to build, and on October 19th of 1833, the church was organized with 15 members. Now, the next clip that you'll see was actually a clip out of, I found online, from the Chicago Tribune in 1923. 90 years later, the First Baptist Church was having a celebration. The First Baptist Church of Chicago was having a celebration, and obviously you can't read the highlighted portion from down here, but what you'll find is one of the great-grandsons of John Temple was actually there helping with the commemoration of it. And so the church was still going and going good at that time. Back to 1833, though, Mr. Freeman was there, and you might say, well, what great things did he did? Well, the truth is, he was only there for about a year and a half. In that time, however, one person I read said he started 3 churches, another said he started 5 churches, but in that short period of time, he was very, very instrumental in going and establishing churches. You say, why would he try to start so many? Well, in April 1834, he submitted the following report, and this is what he said. He said, our Sunday school is flourishing, there being no Baptist minister within a compass of 150 miles of me, while the country is filling up in an unparalleled manner with immigrants from all the East, and a large proportion favorable to Baptist views who are inclined to religion at all, I could not confine my labors exclusively to Chicago. Since my last communication, I've preached 56 times and traveled into most of the settlements. So he began to travel not just in Chicago, but traveled all the settlements all around, and he was actively working to preach in those places. This led to the reason why he would only be there a year and a half. In December of 1834, he traveled 50 miles southwest to a place called Long Grove. There, he traveled for the purpose of simply baptizing a young man by the name of David Matlock, who later would become a faithful minister. On his way back, however, it was December 1834, he was on his way back that 50-mile journey, and a little over halfway back, his horse became very ill. There were no roads. He wasn't traveling on roads, and so he stayed for about 2.5 days, hoping that his horse would get better. There in the freezing cold, it didn't happen, and so he walked the remaining 18 miles back to Chicago through all of the cold. Upon arriving back, he came down with a severe cold, which eventually turned into pneumonia, and just 10 days after arriving back, he died there in Chicago. To understand, though, all of this, you understand his mindset. I want to tell you what his last words were, and in a moment you're going to see a slide where in the north vestibule of the church building, they have a tablet, I'm told, that can still be found with this inscription that contains some of his last words. As he was laying there on his bed with his wife, this man, raised in a preacher's home, said this. He said, tell my father I died at my post and in my master's work. Simple statement, simple ministry, but he did what he was supposed to do in serving God. There in the tablet there in the church building says, in memory of Allen B. Freeman, born 1806, founded this church October 19th, 1833, died December 15th, 1834. I die at my post and in my master's service. So just when we think of our nation, we think of our country, and we think of all that we have, remember that there were people that we hardly even know about that sacrificed to make it happen as a nation, but then also our Baptist heritage, they sacrificed to go to places nobody else wanted to go to, and they suffered hardship we can't imagine just to reach souls for Christ. Allen B. Freeman was one of these little-known heroes of the American time past.